What happens if you ignore a bad O2 sensor? At first, not much. That is exactly why so many drivers ignore it. The car still starts. It still drives. The problem may feel small, just a check engine light, maybe slightly worse fuel economy, maybe a little hesitation. Nothing dramatic. And that is what makes a bad O2 sensor dangerous to ignore, because it usually does not punish you all at once. It gets more expensive gradually. In this video, I will show you what usually happens when a bad O2 sensor gets ignored for too long. So before a small sensor problem turns into a much bigger repair, let's go step by step. Consequence number 1. Fuel economy usually gets worse first. This is one of the earliest real-world changes. The O2 sensor helps the engine computer adjust fuel delivery, so when the sensor becomes slow, lazy, or inaccurate, fuel control starts drifting. And once fuel control drifts, the engine may start using more fuel than necessary. At first, the change may feel small, but over time you realize the pattern. You are filling up more often. Mileage is clearly worse, and nothing else about your driving changed enough to explain it. That is often the first price you pay for ignoring a bad O2 sensor. Consequence number 2. The engine starts running less smoothly. A bad O2 sensor does not just affect fuel cost, it affects how the engine feels. Idle may become rough. Throttle response may feel inconsistent. The car may hesitate, surge, or feel less stable during light acceleration. This usually builds slowly. That is why many drivers keep ignoring it, because the car still runs. It just no longer runs as cleanly or as smoothly as before. And the longer that bad sensor feedback stays, the more the engine keeps making fuel decisions based on bad information. Consequence number 3. The check engine light stays on, and that creates a second problem. A lot of drivers think the warning light itself is the only issue, but once the check engine light stays on too long, another problem begins. You stop taking the light seriously, and that means if a new issue appears later, you may miss it because the warning was already being ignored. This is one reason small sensor problems lead to bigger mistakes, not only because of the sensor itself, but because the car has already been teaching you to ignore a warning that should still matter. Consequence number 4. Emissions go up even if the car still feels usable. This is where some drivers get fooled. The car may still start, still drive, still feel mostly okay, but the emissions system may already be performing worse because the O2 sensor is one of the key inputs the engine uses to control fuel mixture properly. If that feedback is wrong, emissions usually rise. You may not feel this directly, but the car may fail inspection, pollute more, and run less efficiently even before the drivability symptoms become dramatic. That is why still drivable does not mean nothing is going wrong. Consequence number 5. Rich or lean running can start affecting other parts. This is where the real cost begins to grow. A bad O2 sensor can push the engine to run richer or leaner than it should. If it runs too rich, extra fuel can move into the exhaust system. If it runs too lean, combustion may become less stable, and performance may suffer. Either way, the engine is no longer operating the way it was meant to. And once that happens, other parts begin living with the side effects of bad fuel control. That is when a small sensor problem starts becoming a system-wide problem. Consequence number 6. The catalytic converter can become the next victim. This is the consequence many people notice too late. An oxygen sensor is usually not the expensive part. The catalytic converter is. If the engine runs rich for too long, extra fuel and extra heat can damage the converter over time. And once the converter is damaged, the repair bill gets much bigger. That is why ignoring a bad O2 sensor can be such a costly mistake, because the sensor itself is often far cheaper than the emissions damage it can help create when left alone too long. Consequence number 7. You can end up chasing a much bigger problem later. This is the final trap. At first, it was only a sensor issue. Then fuel economy got worse. Then drivability changed. Then the check engine light stayed on. Then emissions increased. Then maybe the catalytic converter started getting damaged. And now, what could have been a smaller repair earlier turns into more diagnosis, more parts, more labor, and more money. That is how a bad O2 sensor gets expensive. Not because the sensor itself always costs a lot, but because ignoring it gives the problem time to spread its effects into other areas. Now here is the big takeaway. What happens if you ignore a bad O2 sensor? Usually nothing dramatic at first. That is the trap. The car still drives, the engine still runs, so the problem gets delayed. But while you delay it, fuel economy often drops, idle and throttle response may get worse, the check engine light stays on, emissions go up, fuel control gets less accurate, and the catalytic converter may eventually become the next damaged part. That is why a bad O2 sensor is not the kind of problem that usually gets better by waiting. It usually gets more expensive by waiting. So let's quickly recap. If you ignore a bad O2 sensor, fuel economy usually gets worse. The engine may run less smoothly. The check engine light stays on. Emissions increase. Fuel control problems begin affecting overall engine behavior. The catalytic converter may get damaged, and the final repair can become much bigger than it needed to be. And now I want to hear from you. What was the first thing that changed on your car? Fuel economy, a check engine light, rough idle, hesitation, or something else? Comment below with what happened first. And if enough people mention the same issue, I will make the next video on how to tell whether an O2 sensor problem is still small or already starting to damage other parts.